Thank you so much. How absolutely right it feels at this moment in time to be in this room surrounded by people who love and support history. For never in our lifetime has the study of history been more important, and never in our lifetime has the study of history been more diminished in our schools or polarized in our communities. So what a joy it is for me. What a joy it is for me to share this night with the Gilder Lehrman Institute, with the magical cast of Hamilton, the Rockefeller Foundation, whose work together has inspired a passion for history in millions and millions of people all over our country and indeed all over the world. I can't think of a perfect place to be other than here tonight. So let me begin by telling you that I've loved history for as long as I can remember. A love that began when my mother, who had had rheumatic fever as a child and left her with a heart that was damaged so that she was largely confined to our house, but by reading books in every spare moment she could find, though having only an 8th grade education, she was transported to places that she could never go. And every night she would read to me, and she loved reading history more than anything. She read to me as long as I could stay awake, that dream of a child never to go to sleep. How I treasured listening to her voice, so much softer and richer than my own. I think the only joy that surpassed listening to her read a book to me was listening to stories about her girlhood. I became obsessed with wanting to know what it was like before her illness set in, when she could talk about her adventures to me, about jumping rope or running the stairs 2 at a time, or running through the park, and her eyes would brighten and the lines on her face would seem to diminish. So I came to believe if I could keep her talking about these days when she was young before her illness set in, that her mind would control her body, and this premature aging process that we were witnessing would just be stopped in its tracks. So I was constantly begging her, "Mom, tell me a story about you when you were my age," not realizing how peculiar that was until I had my own 3 boys who never once had said to me, "Mom, tell us a story about you when you were our age." Well, I was only 15 when my mother had a heart attack and died, but nonetheless, 7 decades later, her love of books and her love of storytelling has become the anchor of my life. But my love of history was also rooted in my father's love of baseball. When I was only 6 years old, he taught me that mysterious art of keeping score while listening to Brooklyn Dodger games. So in the summer, when he went to work in New York during the day, I could record with all my miniaturized symbols the history of that afternoon's game. He would then come home and listen in rapt attention that I told him every play of every inning of the game that afternoon. So I think there's something magic about history, even if it's only 4 or 5 hours old, to keep my father's attention. In fact, I'm convinced that I learned the narrative art from those nightly sessions with my father, because at first I would be so excited. I would blurt out, "The Dodgers won," or "The Dodgers lost," which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. Well, he made it even more special for me in those early days, because he never told me that all of this was actually described in great detail in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me, he wouldn't even know what happened to our beloved Brooklyn Dodgers. But then in high school, this childhood love for history was channeled into American history by a magical teacher, Miss Austin, who won an award for one of the best teachers in New York State. How important are teachers for so many of us who gave us the subject that we fell in love with? How many of us felt that love that the teacher had? Her love for history was contagious. Her eyes would gleam as she brought Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton to life. I really felt she must have known them. She told us in such vivid detail about what they were like. And when she recounted Lincoln's death, tears came into her eyes. I had never seen a teacher cry. I thought, surely she must have known him. That's how incredible she was. So I went to college and graduate school wanting to be a teacher and a storyteller like Miss Austin. That I ended up as a presidential historian was due to the experience of working with Lyndon Johnson when I was 24 years old in the White House, and then the gift he gave me in the last years of his life when he brought me to Texas to work on his memoirs and spent countless hours talking to me. He talked forever. He talked as we were supposedly swimming in the pool. but there were rafts in the pool that had floating notepads on them in case he said anything important. He talked as we walked by the river. He talked when we waited for the movie theater to go at night. He never stopped talking. And his mind went backward in times when he talked to me. He wanted to talk about the days when he was in FDR's National Youth Administration. He wanted to talk about when he was a young congressman and he brought electricity to his beloved Hill Country. And mostly he wanted to talk about the happiest days in the White House when he championed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Throughout his life, he just hoped so much in those last years to be remembered for something other than the war in Vietnam. And it's happening in many ways. I mean, historians are getting him further and further up for what he did. In a recent poll I saw, he actually was number 8 and John F. Kennedy was number 9. How happy he would have been. But most importantly, his face would light up when he talked about civil rights, when he talked about the things that really mattered, Medicare, aid to education, just as my mother's face had lit up when she talked about her early days of her life. And those conversations became the foundation for my first book on Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, which set me on the path to becoming a presidential historian. As it turned out, I ended up studying Lincoln, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, and the great Eleanor Roosevelt, a lifetime of studying dead presidents, which may seem a rather odd career, but I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. My only fear has always been in the afterlife. There's going to be a panel of all these guys that I studied, and each one's going to ask me everything I missed about them. And the first person to scream out will be Lyndon Johnson. How come that damn book on the Roosevelts was twice as long as the book he wrote about me? But I realize now that I've looking back over this 50 or 60-year career that I've involved in, that I always chose challenging times, the most difficult times in our history, the Civil War, the turn of the 20th century, the Great Depression, or World War II. Perhaps it's because, as Abigail Adams said, it is not in the still of life that great characters are formed. It is in the great necessities of life that call out our great virtues. And it is that experience of living in those challenging times that gives me perspective, solace, and hope about our current situation. For however rough our time is, we have lived through really, really rough times before and emerged with greater strength. Just imagine what Abraham Lincoln faced when he came into office. 7 states already seceded from the Union, a civil war that would kill more than 600,000 about to begin. He later said if he had known the pressure he would be under in those first 3 months, he would not have thought he could have lived through it. But he did live through it, for he understood that democracy itself was on trial. He said that if the southern states could secede simply because they had lost an election, it would prove that ordinary people could not govern themselves. Someday the West would secede from the East. Democracy would prove to not be possible. Or imagine what Teddy Roosevelt faced at the turn of the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution had shaken up the economy, much like globalization and the technological revolution have today. People in the rural areas were suspicious of people in the big cities. People in the eastern factories were cut off from the western farmers. Teddy Roosevelt said then that democracy would be in peril if people in different classes, because this was a time when there was a big gap between the rich and the poor, if people in different classes and regions began to think of themselves as the other people as the other rather than as common American citizens, if we lacked empathy for other people in the country, if fellow feeling was lost, an all too familiar feeling today. And then imagine what it was like for FDR coming in at the height of the Depression. 1 out of 4 people out of work, no safety net, starving people wandering the streets, a banking system that had collapsed, homes and mortgages gone from farms and city homes. Somebody said to FDR as he was about to give his first inaugural, you know, if your program works, you're going to be one of the great presidents in history, but if it fails, you'll be one of the worst. He said, no, I will be the last American president. That's how serious democracy was at trial then. And then imagine 1940, I think perhaps the greatest threat to Western civilization ever, when Hitler conquered all of Western Europe, save Britain, when the United States desperately wanted to help, but was only 18th in military power. We were behind Holland, who, when they surrendered, we finally became 17th. And we had 500 fighter planes, a one-day supply in the war. We had more horses than tanks. It was an incredibly anxious time. And the important thing about history is that we know now What the people at the time did not know, we know the end of their stories. We know the Civil War came to an end with the Union restored and emancipation secured. We know the Depression came to an end with the mobilization for the war. We know that the Allies eventually won World War II. But our ancestors did not know how their stories would end, so they suffered with the same fears and anxieties that we are living with now. But what history tells us is that our fear should be matched by hope. For it is never just the leaders we depend upon. It is us. It is the citizens who take the lead. It is up to us to write our next chapter. When Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, "Don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all. It was the settlement houses in the cities and the social gospel, the social justice of religion that made Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal possible. And of course, it was the bravery and courage of the civil rights movement that led to the great progress in the 1960s. And then the women's movement and the gay rights movement. It's always up to us. So long as we can value our history and learn from our struggles as well as our triumphs, a fight we are having right now, we can find lessons and perspective and hope in the knowledge that our inner strengths as a people have brought us through tough times before, and they can do that again. I thank you so much for including me in this truly wonderful gathering. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.